Development and Planning Amendment Bill 2020.
The Honorable, the Minister of Commerce and Planning.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move the second reading of a bill for a law to amend the Development and Planning Law 2017 revision to enhance the efficiency of the authority and to support development in the islands and for incidental and connected purposes.
The bill has been duly moved. Is the Minister speaking there too?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the purpose of these amendments are to enhance the efficiency of the authority by making the planning process more flexible, adaptable, and timelier, while also encouraging development in key areas such as the Georgetown Capital Center. Mr. Speaker, with all that has been thrown at us, our department has seen over 632 planning applications this year alone, with a value of over $504 million. Now, as we push through this pandemic, we can all see the importance of the development sector as it continues to play a vital role, Mr. Speaker, in Cayman's sustainability through investment and employment. Mr. Speaker, this is why the people have the commitment of this government to continue to encourage long-term and sustainable development. Mr. Speaker, while I will subsequently speak to these amendments in greater detail, I'd like to pause and note, for example, that during our Georgetown stakeholder meetings, we heard the importance of providing greater flexibility within the town center as a key element for the initiative's success. As a result, Mr. Speaker, with the publication of this bill, we have had a number of small and large investors seeking to redevelop their property for continued growth and prosperity. Mr. Speaker, I'll outline some of the amendments to this bill. Clause 1 provides a short title of the legislation. Clause 2 seeks to amend Section 13.3 of the Principal Law by inserting a new subsection, AC, to exempt the construction of a liquefied petroleum gas storage tanks not exceeding 1,000 gallons in size from the list of type of developments that require planning permissions under the law. Mr. Speaker, over the years, we've encouraged homeowners to switch to more environmentally friendly fuels, such as propane gas. We have issued over 325 permits for 2019-2020 and installed over 120. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, this amendment will make it easier for homeowners, as such tanks will no longer require planning permission. In addition, Mr. Speaker, it will free up the department's resources, allowing them to focus on more complex and pressing issues. Mr. Speaker, this clause is anticipation of the, Mr. Speaker, Clause 3 seeks to repeal and substitute Section 15.4 of the Principal Law in order to provide new requirements in relation to the submission and assessment of a notice of applications for planning permission. This clause is in anticipation of the Planning Department's building a website where development notices will be posted instead of relying solely on a newspaper publication. Mr. Speaker, this is a pragmatic approach and another step for greater transparency in the building process. Mr. Speaker, once up and running, applicants will have the ease of posting projects that require public notification, while surrounding proprietors can freely review the project and make an informed decision. Similarly, Mr. Speaker, Clause 4 seeks to amend Section 40 of the Principal Law to to include delivery of a notice by registered mail or by courier. Again, Mr. Speaker, we were all affected as the pandemic caused our mail service to grind to a halt, and our newspapers ceased publication for several months. These new methods of notification will give applicants the flexibility to continue with their projects while also providing more transparency and accountability to the process. Mr. Speaker, in wrapping up, I would note that these amendments go hand in hand with the draft regulations that are also put before this Honorable House, in which I will speak to in much greater detail. For instance, Mr. Speaker, we see how this bill supports the Georgetown Revitalization Initiative with consequential amendments in the Draft Development and Planning Amendments Regulations, while the Draft Building Code Amendment Regulations 2020 seeks to introduce the International Swimming Pool and Spa Code that will strengthen our life and safety protocols to better protect our citizens. Again, Mr. Speaker, all in an effort to provide our Caymanians with greater flexibility and security, whether it be for a small homeowner that would like to switch to propane gas or perhaps a local developer wanting to build a small complex in their district. We want the process to be easier and smoother for all. Mr. Speaker, we do have some minor amendments to make. However, I now seek the approval of this Honorable House in passing the Development and Planning Amendment Bill 2020, subject to any amendments that we may make at the committee stage. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, far be it from me to try to stop more efficiency in development in this country. With the background I have, I understand these things quite intimately. But Mr. Speaker, I listened to the minister present this amendment, and there were some things glaringly missing from his presentation, which I expected. Which include but not limited to proper inspection of these facilities under 13, I think it is, wherein, Mr. Speaker, the purpose, let me put it this way, the purpose of planning, application, and requirement is, one, to know what is going down, and two, particularly in the case of dangerous substance such as fuels, is to ensure that we know what is being installed. And I didn't hear how we were going to move ahead with that. I just asked the page to get me the law for the Petroleum Law, because planning requires that all of these people be consulted. That is Water Authority, CUC, NRA, Petroleum, when development is applied for. And development is always approved with the caveat that is subject to their control. Now, I understand petroleum tanks, particularly for liquid propane at homes, but they have always been in small volumes. I'm not saying now, Mr. Speaker, that those are not as dangerous as bigger ones. What I'm saying is, I expect that they are under the control of the inspector, and that aspect of, what's it, off-reg. I think those have all gone on the off-reg. So, I didn't hear enough in this to convince me that we should be placing a 1,000-gallon tank in residential areas without planning oversight or petroleum inspectors' oversight. And I'm a little concerned about that because, Mr. Speaker, whilst there may be a requirement for the petroleum inspector to qualify or approve the types of equipment, tanks that the propane people to whom that are domestic gas are brought in, this opened this up to a different ball game, wherein anyone can bring in a tank and install it. And Mr. Speaker, I understand there are certain safety measures installed on those tanks to prevent them ordinarily not exploding. And I don't know what the standards we use here. The Petroleum Inspectorate would know that. But if anyone can bring in a tank, we don't know what those standards would be for those particular tanks. And I'm a little concerned about that. I don't even know if these are the ones. It's on the ICTA now, right? Petroleum handling and storage. This is 96. It has to be a revision since that. I think we merged these into the ICTA law, the off-reg law. Be that as it may, the one of 78, Mr. Speaker, as I just received, there's not much in this. There isn't much. But I recall when we were doing the law and merging them into the ICTA law, and then subsequently the off-reg, Mr. Speaker, the ministers tell me it's covered under the regulations. But I have, it was an oversight on my part, but I didn't see. I didn't see it therein.
That's not bad music, though.
I don't see which one it is in the amendment to the regs. But Mr. Speaker, 13 is only applying the plan. Yeah, but there is nothing to stop someone from applying for it and getting their own. And the planning department is not qualified to do inspection on tanks, or I don't think so. They are? You mean they understand the integrity of tanks and the likes? I thought that planning would have been asking the authorities, those with the discipline, to go and inspect these tanks and verify whether or not they're suitable for use. I'm a little. It just gives me reason to pause, Mr. Speaker, that it is not as complete as I would like to see it. And I know Mr. Miller and I know the member from Northside, and I talked about it, and I just couldn't capture why we were doing it in this manner. But I mean, if there's an explanation for it, I'm open to that. But I want to bring to the fore the safety measure in this, because 1,000 gallons of propane will certainly leave a crater someplace. I know most of us in here may have installations of I think the 100-gallon tanks, that they are the short ones at our homes. But when you do 1,000 gallons, suppose somebody wants to put it on the ground, as opposed to having it above ground around their homes, it conjures up some concerns for me because of the ambient temperature and whatnot. I mean, we're talking about pressurized liquid. I am not satisfied with what has been said or what I'm seeing here, that we have taken in, and the minister may have some explanation for it, Mr. Speaker, and I would like to know that he does. The other one that I'm concerned about is the amendment of Section 15 also. Section 15, where section 15:4. It says, notice of an application for planning permit, as it is now, having been made to the authority other than an application for permission having relation to a detached house and semi-detached house, duplex, or any temporary development, shall contain an invitation for persons receiving the notice to inspect the application for planning permission, including the application form, prerequisite drawing, land register, and registry extract map in person at the Department of Planning, and shall be served in accordance with any regulations made under this law. And the authority shall not consider an application in the absence of evidence of service or publication, as the case may be, of such notice, and unless 21 days have elapsed since the service of publication, as the case may be, of the last of such required notice. Mr. Speaker, where I am concerned is the amendment is, and this may be trying to be more efficient, but it certainly, in my view, lacks the real reason for inspecting plans for the purposes of objections. Well, that's the only reason you would notify someone, because it's up for objection. This one says where a person makes an application for planning permission to the authority other than an application for permission in relation to a detached house, duplex, or any temporary development, the person shall provide notice of the application, which shall contain an invitation for persons to whom the notice is addressed. And we know what those are, those within the perimeters, within the certain areas, to inspect the requisite drawings relating to an application for planning permission, person at the Department of Planning or via a website authorized by the director for such purpose. No, yeah, understand. But this, as it stands now, you are required to put all land registry and registry extract and the likes for that person who is going to inspect it to be able to properly understand where that development is taking place. We are removing that. We are removing that because we're repealing subsection 4, and now we're replacing it with the requisite. All it's saying is with the requisite drawings relating to an application for planning permission. The drawings that are submitted, whilst they may have a site plan on it, it doesn't have this one requires a land registry. Now I know planning says that they're not responsible for ownership of who's applying for what. Thus the reason why we have so many problems with someone building on another piece of property. And I believe that serves a purpose by having that land registry there. Because once somebody knows they have a piece of land in that area and has been notified, and they go there, and the wrong piece of land property is being built on, they will recognize where it was applied for. Here we're changing it to say it's only the drawings that are required. That's how I understand that. If I am wrong, then I would invite the minister to tell me I'm wrong. And that would be a good day. That then I won't have to worry about it. No, Mr. Speaker, the other section that I had some concerns about was most what you
Well, one thing, Leader of the Opposition, you can't blame that on the Premier.
No, Mr. Speaker, I can't blame it on the Premier, but he probably set up his deputy to do it. Yeah, a little. He might have been trying to throw me off, but a little levity is good for us, especially after yesterday. Mr. Speaker, I looked up the meaning of registered mail in the interpretation law, but the interpretation law is so far so incomplete that we don't even know, because this was revised in 1995. Registered use with reference to a document means recorded under the provisions of the law applicable to the registration of such document. I don't know why we now have to, and I understand, but what we're doing is leaving in prepaid. When Korea is prepaid, I don't know if there's any necessity for the duplication. Nowadays, we have now moved on to a new regime of communication, and Korea, in those days when this was done, prepaid registered letter is through the post office. And nowadays, Korea, and I don't know if we're trying to cover all the bases. I mean, add in Korea now so that they can use that medium as well.
As I said during COVID, no post office. No ability to get notices and stuff, so just giving more
Yeah. I'm comfortable if that is to add into it. Mind you, it was just a passing thought on what when I saw it. So we need not pay close attention to that one. But the one with the requisite drawings related to an application for planning permission, maybe it needs to go a little further than that, because, Mr. Speaker, we know that the site plan is stuck in a little corner that you can barely see really, or you can't decipher it. And Mr. Speaker, I know this is somewhat unrelated, but the zoning that we're doing in the regulations, you can't see that. You can't even read the roads so we can understand the extent of it. So I'm wondering if, when that time comes, Mr. Speaker, like I said, it's unrelated but to the law, but when that time comes that we're dealing with this, I would like to see to what extent this thing What's that? What's that telescope they have on that look on the moon? Hubble? You need that for this. There's no human eyesight can decipher this. Can somebody try to get some larger maps for us, please, before we reach that motion, Mr. Speaker? Thank you, sir.
Member for Northside.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I wish to make a contribution to the debate on the Development and Planning Amendment Bill 2020 now before this Honorable House. And Mr. Speaker, I wish to thank the government for bringing this before the House, not because I can offer my usual enthusiastic support for government business, but because it provides me an opportunity to relieve hardship and suffering of Caymanians because of the removal of a section of the Development and Planning Law in 2014. Mr. Speaker, in 2014, the Development and Planning Law 2011 revision was amended by the Development and Planning Amendment Bill 2014, which deleted from the principal law section 13(3), subsection 3F, which allowed or permitted Caymanians to enlarge or improve or other alterations of their dwelling house or home without planning permission or application, as long as it did not exceed 10% of the square footage of the house. Now, Mr. Speaker, at the time that that was done, I opposed the removal of that section because that's the traditional way that Caymanians have expanded their houses to accommodate increases in the family, etc., all over these years. And I saw no particular reason or that it was causing any undue hardship to Caymanians to allow them to continue to do that. But the government insisted on removing it, and the only thing they agreed to was that it would be done for free. And we were given the assurance by the minister at the time, who was Mr. Kurt Tibbetts, that we didn't have to worry about it because all a Caymanian homeowner would have to do was to do a little sketch themselves with the dimensions of the extension that they wanted to put and show the relationships to boundary setbacks, and it would be stamped by planning and you could go about your business. And while that might have been true at the time, subsequent amendments to the Development and Planning Law have made that process impossible, because one of the things that is now required is that only architects or agents can submit plans to planning. And Mr. Speaker, I noticed in the minister's presentation, he talked about these amendments basically being development driven for Georgetown and part of the revitalization of Georgetown, etc. And that's all good and proper. But we have to be careful in making these accommodations to developers and requiring additional regulations and restrictions that developers have to meet, that at the same time we're not regulating or Caymanian homeowners out of the possibility of getting an alteration or expanding the house. And my experience in recent times, Mr. Speaker, in my constituency, and I've also had reports from other constituencies, is that this is creating real hardship for Caymanians. In my constituency, I had a single mother with a child who had a house, approved by planning, built to all planning specifications, and wanted to add a 8 by 10, I think it was, little patio on the back where she could put a barbecue grill, etc., to entertain her daughter and friends. And I think the neighbors complained to planning, and they sent their enforcement officers out there and shut it down. And when I tried to assist her, I ran into this thing that it had to be done by an architect and an agent, and oftentimes that can be more costly than the addition itself. Or it can, in this case, it would have consumed so much of the capital available to the person who wanted to do this that they could not do the expansion. And Mr. Speaker, I know that part of the presentation at the time was that planning needs to know what you're doing to your house, and we have to be within the safety requirements, and etc. But the over-provision that planning requires for most dwelling houses in terms of electrical provision and plumbing provisions, adding something onto your house really is not going to fall into that dangerous thing where you're likely to be overloading electrical circuits and causing fires, etc. And I have no knowledge of these kind of eventualities taking place, which would have encouraged government to remove this restriction and make it harder on Caymanians to expand their house. In fact, more recently, in my constituency, someone wanted to put an 8-foot by 23-foot back porch patio onto their house. And they were told the same thing. And when the person went to speak to the architect, that person carried with them a drawing that they had prepared, showing the location of the house on the property with all the setbacks, plenty of space to put this thing. I mean, it was still about 30 feet from the boundary. And said to the architect, I need you to draw this and stamp it so I can take it in. I said, no, you can't do it like that. So I said, wait. And the person said, well, what do you mean? Well, I have to come out to the site. I have to produce a plan of your whole house, unless planning is a very up modern house and planning has the plans and drawings readily accessible to them. Otherwise, I have to come out and do this whole thing. It has to be done to scale. I got to draw the whole house, show you electrical loads, plumbing loads, and then the addition to the house. And the person said, well, okay, how much does it cost? He said, well, give me a deposit of $500 and I'll start the plans. I don't think the person has gone back to receive the completed plans to know what the final bill will be, but it's not likely to be $1,000. The $500 was unlikely to be 50% deposit. So, Mr. Speaker, I have filed an amendment to this bill before us to amend Clause 2 by inserting after the paragraph AC, which is in the bill, that deals with the construction of fuel, liquefied petroleum gas storage, to insert a new paragraph E, which would be a reinsertion of a portion of the paragraph F that was repealed in 2014, which will read, the enlargement, improvement, or other alteration of a dwelling house, provided that the square footage of the enlargement does not exceed 10% of the square footage of the ground floor and the house is a single story. Because that section of the planning law refers to those things which are exempted from planning permission. So if we put it in like that, it means that Caymanians will once again be able to enlarge, improve, or alter their dwelling house as long as the square footage of the enlargement does not exceed 10% of the square footage of the ground floor and the house is a single-story house. Mr. Speaker, I hope that the government will accept that amendment and that we can provide the relief that Caymanians need in order to do these minor alterations and enlargements of their homes. Because I believe it is important. One of the instances that I am aware is that one person was trying to add a 4x8 bathroom onto a bedroom so that they could rent the bedroom and the bathroom in order to improve their income because they're retired people. And they were served with a stop notice from the enforcement arm of planning, and they now fall into that category that they have to submit plans, etc., to build this little bathroom onto the house. So I hope that the government will reconsider and accept this amendment, which I believe will be welcomed by Caymanians. Because one of the things that seems to be happening in these development and planning regulations, and I have several amendments, not to anticipate the debate thereof, already filed for the development and planning regulations, and I have some concerns about the building code as well. Because my concern is that in trying to make sure that developers do things right and comply with planning regulations, we don't put regulations on average Caymanians in terms of their own houses that makes it difficult for them to survive economically in this country. Because many of the planning regulations don't make any exemptions for single-family dwelling homes, etc. And I believe that that is something we need to make sure of. In addition to that amendment, Mr. Speaker, I also have concerns about Clause 3. 4A contain an invitation for the person to whom the notice is addressed to inspect the requisite drawings related to an application for planning permission in person at the Department of Planning or via a website authorized by the director for such purposes. Now, while I applaud what we hope will be the efficiency and effectiveness of peoples like members of Parliament who want to be concerned about development taking places in their constituency, will have access to a website to look at some of this stuff, as opposed to taking a day to go down to planning and get in line to go and look at plans. And sometimes when you get there, the plans are somewhere else and you can't see them that day. You got to come back another day and another day and another day. But my concern is with those two little words, requisite drawings, replacing the application. Because when I go to planning to look at an application for something that is going on in my constituency, I want to know where in the constituency is going to happen. Most of the times I want to know who's doing the development as well. And looking at the drawings for the development is not going to provide that kind of information. And again, I am not aware of any abuse of members of the public, particularly most of this is limited to those who are affected, because although I can go and look at it, I have, as a member of the Legislative Assembly, from my constituency point of view, I cannot go to the planning board and object. They took that out a long time ago. They removed public objection. You have to be within a specified area, distance, if you want to be objected. And I know that from being invited as a witness in one such objection to do with a project in my constituency, and being told by the chairman of the board that I had to leave. Well, he got saved by the lawyer who was representing the client, responding before I got the chance to respond and telling him that I was not there as a member of the Legislative Assembly. I was there as a potential as a witness for the objectors. And so I was allowed to stay. So, as I say, I have filed an amendment to replace the two words requisite drawing with complete application, because I believe it is important in many of these instances, especially when it's related to development and not to single family homes. Because this talks about permission to the authority other than the application for permission in relation to a detached house, duplex, or any temporary development. So we obviously are talking here about large-scale developments that could have an impact on the whole constituency, the whole island, in fact. So, Mr. Speaker, if the government will accept those two minor amendments, I will be in a position to extremely, gleefully, and enthusiastically support the bill. Without those two amendments, or certainly without the 10% allowance for Cayman is being put back, I'm likely to, at a bare minimum, abstain on the bill, if not vote against it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member wish to speak? If not, I'll call on the minister for his right of reply.
Get up real quick. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Leader of the Opposition and the member from Northside. I would be disappointed had they not gotten up to speak on these, or flattered, one or the other, I'm not sure. Mr. Speaker, the member from East End raised a couple of concerns. One on Section 13 on the propane tank installation, and as I said, it was just the idea here was to remove one more another step of bureaucracy along the way. You still have to apply for to BCU for a LG permit under that code. You would submit that application, receive a red card, and go through the necessary inspections before approval. These are all regulated under the gas code and an NFPA, such as NFPA 58, which governs all the standards about including underground tanks, distance away from windows, walls, generators, etc. I'll do my best, and we'll add some more wordage on to the in the regulations when we come in. I'll do my best to expand upon that, but I hope that gives the member, the Leader of Opposition, some comfort in knowing that we still inspect it, we still go through it. It just does not have to go in for planning approval. So we're just taking out that step where you go in and you apply for permitting rather than CPA for planning approval. The section 15, both on the requisite drawings, both members raised this. So the idea here again, and the reason for the amendment was to have the ability to publish the drawings online for persons who either are not able to or prefer not to go in and physically inspect the plans. They would have the ability to do so online. Unfortunately, for privacy reasons, and because when we download, if we were to download all of the things such as the land registrar and that sort of stuff, that comes with a whole lot more information that we would not be able to or would not want to publish on the website. So everything is still available at planning in the same way. Well, we can confirm that and spell it out, absolutely. But you would still be able to go and see everything. We just want to have the ability and the access and the efficiency. Right. Yeah. So if you have a look at it, you're the neighbor, you're happy. If you have some concerns, you go down and you can look at everything else. The member from leader of the opposition also raised some concerns, Madam Speaker, about the, it's a good thing I looked up, about the notices. And again, a lesson learned from the COVID pandemic and the subsequent shelter in place, etc., where we were limited to newspapers and the post office, where both were completely out of commission. And in instances where persons are not able to, we have a lot of issues with changed post box addresses. We all see that printed newspaper is struggling at the moment. And so we thought that it would be beneficial to add couriers and other methods of getting the notices out to individuals. The leader of the honorable member from North Side raised the issue of the 10% addition, and I just want to say that I'm sympathetic, certainly sympathetic of the argument raised by the member and the challenges that some may face with this, but there is a flip side to it. There is another side to it where persons may find themselves in even more problems. Let's not even talk about the life safety aspects of it, but when they're faced with, and were during the previous regulations, faced with the after the fact issues because they did not build within the 10% or because they did not follow the process, and then of course you have your life safety issues. The previous version of the law, which was the 2011 Development and Planning Law, had a number of things you had to adhere to. The criteria under the Development Law of 2011 for the 10% was that the square footage of the enlargement does not exceed 10% of the square footage of the ground floor or the house. So that is very difficult to work out unless you have the drawings and you are doing it to scale so that you know that you're within the 10 feet. But then when you get hit with the after the fact because it isn't, then that's where the hardship comes in. The enlargement is single story. The regulations governing setbacks of buildings and coverage on site are still upheld, and the enlargement is an integral part of the existing dwelling house. So the idea of adding on a room to rent was not a part of that, would not be approved under the 10% in the 2011 law. A notice of intention to construct under this section is forwarded to the authority. So you still had to notify the authority. And what we had happening, Mr. Speaker, is that, again, because things were not to scale, etc., we had persons building outside of the 10%. We had many instances of persons building outside of the code, which created issues further on. Persons were not building within the setbacks because they were not following the proper process. And some people took the idea that, oh, you could add 10% per year, 10% at a time, so when you finish one 10%, you can do another 10%, and we had issues where people were encroaching, building right up to the walls. Can you imagine the mess with the electrical and the loads, etc., as they continue to add on these 10%? The process, right now, and it's important to realize that both regulations, the then 2011 law and the new law, the requirement for planning does not include works to the interior. And if an applicant meets all of the requirements, setbacks, codes, etc., then it is simply an administrative application. If you need your scale drawings, and I can appreciate the member did point out that some persons, the home may be so old that there may not be record of the scale drawings at planning, but if they are, you can come in and request those and they will provide those to you. And again, Mr. Speaker, this is all being done out of, at the end of the day, for the protection of the individual. Life safety, ensuring that the place is wired properly. Today's contractors, unfortunately, are not, we don't know as many as the contractors. In the old days, you knew that if you're going to build, you get, this gentleman or that gentleman. Today, things are different. And once you leave it open for the ability that or the chance that the contractor knows that they're not going to be inspected and they don't do things to code, then you may have damage, you may have life safety issues, and then the individuals are left with the mess to try and clean up on their own or try to repair on their own. And worse than that is if someone just simply adds on to the house, and well, because they get inspected. Then you have the situation where the person will build outside of the 10% or don't meet the minimum setbacks, etc. And then you have an after-the-fact application which will cost them 3 times the cost would normally. Then they have to get somebody to come in and redraw it or draw it, which is almost always more difficult to draw after the fact than to design it in the first place. And these are the kind of hardships that we found persons going through when they were not or following or misinterpreted the 10% rule. Mr. Speaker, I will say that I constantly remind the ministry and the department that we have the easiest way to get people to comply with the law is to make it as easy as possible for them and to assist them as much as possible. So we will continue to review the process and to see how, or to try and identify any further efficiencies or cost savings that we can and make the process as easy as possible. But we do have a responsibility for neighbors, we have a responsibility for life safety of the individual, and we feel that this is the best way. Mr. Speaker, the member also touched on decks, and it is so that you do have to get administrative approval on decks over 6 inches. So if it is a paver, you're paving the back area, all of that is fine. Once you go over 6 inches, then you do have to apply for approval. So it's a height. There are issues where we've had numerous complaints in the past from neighbors because persons have decked it right out to the back wall and they've built it up 4 feet, so they're looking into the into the neighbor's backyard, etc. We have life safety issues, again, load factors, not building the decks properly, and challenges such as those. And so that is the reason why we require the application. It does not require an architect. It should be to scale. And I can appreciate that not everyone can do that, but it does not require it to be a registered architect or engineer, but to be built to scale, or to be drawn to scale. Yeah. Yes, sir, if it's to scale. So, Mr. Speaker, I think I covered everything that both the member from East End and the member from Northside raised, and as I said in the upcoming motions on the regulations, we'll get into further details on these things. But once again, I ask the support of this House in passing these amendments to further strengthen the development and the sustainable development and laws surrounding it, as well as providing further efficiencies for the general public and those that we serve, and the development of the Georgetown revitalization effort. Thank you.
Question is, the bill shortly entitled the Development and Planning Amendment Bill 2020 be given a second reading. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against?
No.
The ayes have it. The Development and Planning Amendment Bill 2020 has been given a second reading.
Securities Investment Business Amendment Number 2 Bill 2020.
Honorable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg to move the second reading of a bill shortly entitled the Securities Investment Business Amendment Number 2 Bill 2020.
The bill has been duly moved. Honorable Premier, are you speaking there too?
Yes, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the bill seeks to amend the Securities Investment Business Amendment. Sorry, Mr. Speaker. The bill seeks to amend the Securities Investment Business Law for the purpose of ensuring that interests in limited liability partnerships can be included as a security. This amendment to the Securities Investment Business Law is packaged with the Limited Liability Partnership Amendment Number 2 Bill 2020, which, Mr. Speaker, I intend to introduce following this successful second reading of this bill to ensure limited liability partnerships can be widely utilized in transacting financial service business. Mr. Speaker, this bill changes the definition of partnership to include limited liability partnerships and that of the definition of a security to include interests in a limited liability partnership. The importance of this amendment is that it will allow limited liability partnerships to be utilized in most, if not all, circumstances where the interest has been expressed, namely either as a vehicle through which local professional service firms, including licensed accountants, can structure their business affairs, or more generally in the financial services sector, where it is contemplated that limited liability partnerships may be employed as a general partner or management entity or as a fund vehicle in certain circumstances. Mr. Speaker, the introduction of the Limited Liability Partnership Law 2017 benefited and was largely driven by the demand amongst local professional practitioners who saw an opportunity to conduct their business operations more efficiently and competitively and to attract new lines of business to the country. The Ministry acknowledges the contribution of industry practitioners and stakeholders in particular, highlighting the contributions of the Financial Services Legislative Committee under the leadership of the Chairman, Mr. Charles Jennings. Mr. Speaker, examination of the bill. The bill is arranged into 3 clauses. Clause 1 contains the short title and commencement provisions of the bill. Clause 2 amends Section 2 of the Principal Law by deleting the definition of the word partnership and substituting a new definition which defines partnership as a general or limited partnership established under the Partnership Law 2013 revision, an exempted limited partnership registered under the Exempted Limited Partnership Law 2018 revision, a limited liability partnership formed and registered under the Limited Liability Partnership Law 2017, or a partnership or limited liability partnership established under the laws of a jurisdiction other than the islands. Clause 3 amends Schedule 1 of the Principal Law to include as a security, which which constitutes a share, interests in a limited liability partnership which is formed and registered under the Limited Liability Partnership Law 2017, an interest in a limited partnership, an exempted limited partnership, or a limited liability partnership which is established under the laws of a jurisdiction other than the islands.
Does any other member wish to speak? The member for Bordentown West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My comments on this bill would actually be very brief, because I think if the bills are reversed in a different order, this amendment would have made a little bit more sense to members and the listening public, because the real impact is actually in the bill to follow. But just want to say, Mr. Speaker, briefly that we do recognize, as usual, that the financial services industry is a constantly changing industry, and we have to continue to find ways to innovate in order to stay alive. And I think, if anything, now more than ever, Caymanians have come to appreciate the role that the financial industry plays in this country. I mean, I think if you look at the latest ESO stats, financial services employ around 9 or 10% of our working population, but their contribution to the GDP and the overall success of the country, I think especially during these times, and being able to support even so many of government other services, I think they have proven their bit in that regard. There's still some other issues that we need to address in financial services, but we will just tackle those things more in the other bill as we get into that. But for right now, I just rise on behalf of my colleagues in the official opposition to say that we are okay with this amendment. Thank you.
Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member wish to speak? If not, I'll call on the Honorable the Mover for his right of reply.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honorable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to thank the elected member for Bordentown West for his remarks and for his indication of the support of the opposition for this bill, despite the grumblings of the leader of the opposition. I also, Mr. Speaker, thank all members on this side of the House for their tacit support. And note, Mr. Speaker, for the record, that the Honorable Minister for Financial Services, Tara Rivers, is still at her son's bedside at hospital. He is still quite ill, but he is, they believe, making some good progress, and hence the reason why I am introducing these bills. We wish her, Mr. Speaker, I'm sure I am at liberty to say, we wish her, all of us in this honorable House, and little Roman, all the very best, and pray for his swift and full recovery.
Thank you. The question is that a bill shortly entitled the Securities Investment Business Amendment Number 2, Bill 2020, be given a second reading. All those in favor?
Aye.
Those against? The ayes have it. The Securities Investment Business Amendment Number 2, Bill 2020 has been given a second reading.
Limited Liability Partnership Amendment Number 2 Bill 2020.
The Honorable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg to move the second reading of a bill shortly entitled Limited Liability Partnership Amendment Number 2, Bill 2020.
The bill has been duly moved. Honorable Premier, speaking thereto.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this bill seeks to amend the Limited Liability Partnership Law 2017 with the purpose of further improving the jurisdiction's anti-money laundering, counter-financing of terrorism, and beneficial ownership information framework. Mr. Speaker, the minister on behalf of the government indicated to this honorable House earlier that the Limited Liability Partnership Law would be activated in this year, 2020. However, in order to deliver on this commitment, it is necessary to ensure that the Limited Liability Partnership Law is in all aspects market ready. The Limited Liability Partnership, which is a hybrid of a company and a partnership, is the jurisdiction's latest business vehicle for transacting both domestic and international business. Consequently, this bill ensures that the legislative framework for limited liability partnerships addresses 2 of the 63 recommended actions raised by the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force assessors in the Cayman Islands' 4th round mutual evaluation report, which are applicable to limited liability partnerships. The bill also contains amendments to the beneficial ownership framework, which are supplemental to the amendments brought to this House in January of this year to further improve the jurisdiction's beneficial ownership framework. Mr. Speaker, may I remind this House that the previous bill, the Securities Investment Business Amendment Number 2 Bill 2020, ensures that the limited liability partnership can be widely used in various contemplated circumstances for transacting business. The other key amendments in this bill ensure the efficient operation of the law by aligning the naming provisions and definitions in the law with the equivalent provisions in the company's law and the limited liability company's law. The bill also clarifies there is no agency relationship between managing partners in the limited liability partnership. Finally, this bill also corrects errors and omissions in the substantive law. Mr. Speaker, both of the bills were developed in consultation with the Ministry and the relevant implementing agency, which is the Cayman Islands General Registry. Consultation with the financial services industry took place with the Ministry, benefiting from the input of the Cayman Islands Monetary Authority, the Financial Services Legislative Committee, and the established Beneficial Ownership Working Group for Limited Liability Partnerships. The input of stakeholders was duly considered, and where appropriate, changes incorporated into the bills before the House today. Mr. Speaker, the bill amends the information that should be provided by limited liability partnerships upon registration and provides for circumstances for it to be made publicly available. This is in line with recommended Action 27 raised in the Mutual Evaluation Report, which said the Cayman Islands needs to implement measures to allow for the basic regulating powers on legal persons to be publicly available. Accordingly, the bill adds as new particulars the nature of business, the financial year, which the limited liability partnership will be required to update with the limited liability partnership's annual return. The bill has also been amended the law is also being amended to allow for registration statement information to be made publicly available by the registrar following payment of a fee. Mr. Speaker, I wish to bring to the House's attention that the importance of the nature of business, in addition to meeting the recommended action, is a necessary tool to understand the money laundering, terrorist financing, and proliferation financing risks that exist with legal persons in the jurisdiction. A similar provision is included in the Companies Law and the Limited Liability Companies Law. Mr. Speaker, the Limited Liability Partnership Amendment Number 2 Bill 2020 also introduces an administrative fines penalty framework for beneficial information. This new administrative fine penalty regime ensures that limited liability partnerships address the concerns made by the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force and that of the United Kingdom in their statutory review of the Exchange of Notes Agreement entered into with the Cayman Islands and other overseas territories. The bill also makes the corporate service provider, rather than the limited liability partnership, responsible for issuing restriction notices for non-compliance with legislative requirements. Specifically, the bill provides a power for the registrar of limited liability partnerships to impose an administrative fine on a person who breaches a beneficial ownership provision in the law that is specified in the schedule within 6 months of becoming aware of the breach. Each of the 16 provisions that can be breached is listed in the new schedule. The fine for breaching one of the 16 provisions is a maximum of $5,000, with discretion for the registrar to impose an additional $1,000 per month fine where the breach continues until the breach is rectified. The fines are paid, or the fines reach the maximum of $25,000. Mr. Speaker, the amendments to the law allow for the registrar to issue rules and guidance in relation to this power. The General Registry has finalized and published the Industry Enforcement Manual for this already, which outlines their process when applying the fines and also how payment can be made. These amendments will demonstrate to the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force that there are dissuasive sanctions in place for a limited liability partnership's non-compliance with the beneficial ownership legislation. Mr. Speaker, I also bring to your attention that similar to the Companies Law and Limited Liability Companies Law, this bill shifts the responsibility of issuing a restrictions notice from the limited liability partnership to the corporate services provider engaged by the limited liability partnership for the provision of registered office services. A restrictions notice would be issued by a limited liability partnership where they have not received a response within 30 days to a notice for information from a beneficial owner. Once this restrictions notice is served, there are restrictions imposed on what can be done with the relevant interest in the limited liability partnership until there is compliance. It is anticipated that such a change, which was the result of the industry feedback, will increase the effectiveness of the jurisdiction's beneficial ownership regime. Mr. Speaker, turning to the clauses in the bill is arranged into 19 clauses. Clause 1 contains the short title and commencement provisions of the bill. Clause 2 amends Section 2 of the law to introduce definitions of dual foreign name and permitted electronic means. The clause also provides for a new definition of regulatory laws. Clause 2 also repeals and substitutes subsection 3, which provides for anything that the managing partner is required by this law to do where a limited liability partnership has more than one managing partner, to be done by any one of the managing partners. Clause 3 amends Section 8 of the law by repealing subsection 1 and substituting proposed new subsections 1 to 1F. Clause 4 inserts a new Section 8A to align the provisions with respect to the registrations of the name of the limited liability partnership with requirements under the Companies Law 2020 revision and the Limited Liability Companies Law 2020 revision. Clause 5 amends Section 9 of the law to require a limited liability partnership to include in its register of partners photographic evidence of the identity of the managing partner, and where the managing partner is an individual, their residential address. Clause 6 amends Section 18 of the law to require a limited liability partnership to include in its registration statement the date of the end of the limited liability partnership's financial year. Also inserted is a proposed new subsection 5, which requires the registrar to make certificates or other documents under subsection 3 available for inspection by any person on payment of a fee as prescribed by the Cabinet, subject to such conditions as the registrar may impose. Clause 6 also inserts a proposed subsection 6, which entitles any member of the public to be informed by the registrar on request of the location of the registered office of any limited liability partnership registered under the law. Clause 7 amends Section 20 of the law to require a limited liability partnership to include the nature of business in the statement in its annual return. Clause 8 amends Section 31 of the law to empower the registrar to strike a limited liability partnership off the register under the specified circumstances, including where an administrative fine is imposed by the registrar on the limited liability partnership in accordance with Part 9 remains unpaid. Clause 9 amends Section 38 of the law to correct an incorrect reference. Clause 10 amends Section 47 by repealing and substituting subsection 2 of the law with a new subsection 2, which aligns the penalty provisions for making a false statement with Section 51(4) of the Limited Liability Companies Law 2020 revision. Clause 11 amends Section 52 of the law by replacing references to the list published in the Gazette and referred to in Regulations 22D and 23(1) of the Anti-Money Laundering Regulations 2018 revision, with references to the jurisdictions that are designated as having measures for combating money laundering and the financing of terrorism, which are equivalent to the islands in accordance with Section 52A of the Proceeds of Crime Law 2020 revision. Clause 12 makes amendments to Section 63 to replace the responsibility for issuing a restrictions notice from the limited liability partnership to the corporate services provider. Clause 13 makes amendments in Section 72 to replace the responsibility for issuing a restrictions notice from the limited liability partnership to the corporate services provider. The clause also provides the factors that the corporate services provider should consider in deciding whether to send a restrictions notice. Clause 14 makes amendments in Section 77 to empower the corporate service provider that issues a restrictions notice to apply to the court for an order directing that the relevant interests cease to be subject to restrictions. Clause 15 makes amendments in Section 78 to provide for the court to order that the relevant interests subject to restrictions to be sold, provided that the court approves the sale on application by the corporate services provider of a limited liability partnership that issues a restriction notice. In this clause, it is the corporate services provider and not the limited liability partnership that is issuing the restrictions notice. Clause 16 makes amendments in Section 80 to replace the responsibility for withdrawal of a restrictions notice from the limited liability partnership to the corporate services provider. Clause 17 makes amendments in Section 87 to provide for the Cabinet to make regulations respecting the procedure to be followed by corporate services providers of limited liability partnerships issuing and withdrawing restriction notices. Clause 18 inserts Part 9 into the law, which sets out the administrative fines framework. A new Section 88 empowers the registrar to impose administrative fines on persons who breach any provision specified in the new schedule. New Section 89 provides that the fine for an initial breach is $5,000, with discretion for the registrar to impose an additional $1,000 per month where the breach continues until either the breach is rectified, the fines are paid, or the fines reach $25,000. A new Section 93 provides that the registrar may issue guidance on the enforcement of administrative fines, and a new Section 95 empowers the Cabinet to make regulations to provide for the forms and procedures for imposing fines and appeals against decisions. Clause 19 provides for the insertion of the schedule pursuant to Part 9, which is to provide for administrative fines, into the law. Mr. Speaker, this concludes my presentation of the proposed bill. During the 21-day statutory public consultation period, there were no additional comments received from stakeholders. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, as we have ourselves found no further issues with the bill, there will be no committee stage amendments to the bill. I therefore, Mr. Speaker, commend this bill to the Honorable House for its second reading.
Does any other member wish to speak? The member for Bordentown West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That's got something to lean on. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday morning, I think it was yesterday morning, I'd gotten a call from the Honorable Leader of the Opposition asking if we would have been okay or comfortable with if there were any issues that we had with this, well, the last two bills, with the ministers being unavoidably absent from the Delhi, and that he was going to reach out to the Premier about bringing this bill in the minister's stead. I told him it was pretty straightforward. There was nothing controversial. The only thing really, we were aware that we have the CFATF review, and we had some things that we needed to get sorted out in that regard. And this bill basically seeks to sort out or to fix those issues that were raised from the CFATF report. So, pretty much from that standpoint, Mr. Speaker, we are pretty much okay with it. As I said previously before, I think in this global pandemic, the financial services industry has proven its mettle with regards to its contribution to our overall economy. And one of the things I just wanted to use this opportunity to speak about, Mr. Speaker, is the overall importance of this industry to our economy. I'm not going to get overly deep into it, but just a kind of surface level conversation, in that if you look at the latest 2019 compendium of statistics that came out or was published, or it is in the public domain, you will directly see that financial services between 2011 and 2019 has ranged between 2011 and 2018 have ranged around 10% of our total workforce in terms of all the jobs and everything by industry. But what really had kind of caught my attention is that while it has averaged between 8, 9, 10% between 2011 and 2018, for 2019 it actually dropped to 7% of our overall industry, going from 3,509 jobs in 2011 to 3,502 jobs in 2019. In other words, there was a slight decrease, or it has remained relatively flat over the last between 2011 and 2019. If you look at the other industries during that time period, Mr. Speaker, those industries have actually increased in terms of their employment. And the reason why I want to raise this issue, or the reason why I'm raising this issue, is that I have always broken down our two pillars or our industries into two simple words: the hunters and the farmers. Those who bring in the business, those who bring in the money, and then those who basically manage the money, move the money around, and the other jobs that get created from money that comes in. Slice it and dice it any way you want, Mr. Speaker. The two pillars of our economy is still banking and tourism. Those are the main drivers of where our income comes from to generate economic activity in our country. And if you look within the main one, which is financial services, as I said a while ago, between 2011 and 2019, the number of jobs have remained flat, while the overall total amount of jobs in the country have gone from 35,267 in 2011 to 47,395 in 2019. So we're talking about roughly more than 12,000 jobs being increased in our overall economy. But one of the main drivers, which is financial services, has remained relatively flat. And the number that, the reason, again, I just want to emphasize is between 2018, when it represented 10% of our overall workforce. So in 2018, we had 4,425 jobs in financial services, and out of a total of 44,742. But in 2019, and this is what prompted me to have this conversation today, while we increased the total amount of jobs in our economy from 44,742 to 47,395, the total amount of jobs in financial services dropped by close to 1,000, going from 4,425 to 3,502. And that is the drop that actually scares me, because it now actually represents 7% of our total jobs in 2019. And when we see this industry not having the growth that we expected to, and the other industries that are very dependent on this industry, because at the end of the day, the real estate industry, the supermarkets, the customs revenue, everything is all driven by the economic activity from funds created by financial services and tourism. And we need to make sure that we remain competitive in this industry. And we also need to make sure that we do what we need to do to keep this industry going. Now, a lot of people sometimes, when I speak to them about financial services industry, I can say that many members in that industry have not done a good enough job in terms of promoting their importance to our overall economy. And I think, especially now, I think people need to understand why this economy is important to us. The one thing, Mr. Speaker, though, that still eludes me or still is a problem is, even though there was a drop between 2018 and 2019 in the total amount of jobs, the number of permits between 2018 and 2019 in that area actually went up. And if we have jobs that are basically dropping from year to year, but the permits are going up, then the question comes in to say, naturally it means that we lost more Caymanians jobs than we had in terms of permit holders. And I think that is one of the things that we need to take seriously. I mean, last night the Premier had even mentioned the issue with even Butterfield Bank in terms of laying off staff. And one of the things, as I said then, is that we find some of our businesses here moving to cheaper jurisdiction in order to get work done. So the cost of living, or the high cost of doing business in Cayman, especially in financial services in terms of regulations and everything else, is one of the other things that we need to be mindful of in terms of what it is that we can do to make the Cayman Islands more competitive with regards to international business. And I want to say this, Mr. Speaker, is that when you do look at other areas such as banking, and I just want to just kind of put some banking stats in, so members and the listening public can understand where I'm coming from. If you look at the Class B banking only, we went from an high of 288 Class B only license down now to 74 at the end of 2019. On the Class B banking and trust, we went from a high of 201 to now we're at 42. So between those two industries alone, or those two license classes, we have lost basically almost 80% of the business at that point. And these are the kind of jobs that many Caymanians would sometimes have. These are small offices. Sometimes they employ one or two employees, sometimes 3 or 4. Depends on the amount of activities that these banks have. And same again also in terms of trust only, where that has actually, we have seen some actually increases in trust, but that is in terms of where it's coming from, but that is also starting to decrease now. But the point I'm making, Mr. Speaker, is that we need to remain competitive, but at the same time we need to make sure we're reducing costs, because if we are losing activity and we're losing jobs in this sector, and this is the job that actually drives, or this is one of the main drivers of our economic activity, then we need to start paying more serious attention to it. Equally so, I can tell you from speaking to some people within this industry, and I'm going to say something now that some people are not going to like, but I'm just going to put it out there as I basically got it and understand where people are coming from. Things like the Legal Practitioners Bill and immigration laws and so forth actually impact this industry seriously. And those are other issues that we need to tighten up and look at real seriously if we want to continue being in financial services, because it is still a global arena. We operate in a global area, and I know with 7 months before election, nobody want to hear about the legal services bill, but this is one of the things, because at the end of the day, the biggest hunters that we have in our economy is still the lawyers, and that is one area that still needs to be fixed, that one area that still needs to be addressed. And I don't know if it's something that we're going to deal with before this session is out, but nonetheless, we need to really take a deep dive into that overall industry, because the numbers are actually trending in the wrong way with this financial services industry. And to borrow the quote from my colleague from the honorable colleague from Savannah, if we lose this industry, dog nyam will supper. I mean, so this is one industry, and it is not politically correct when you start speaking about immigration or having even some liberal views on immigration within this industry, but it's one industry that we need to take a serious look at when it comes on to both the legal services bill and the immigration laws, to make sure that we can still attract the hunters that we need to bring business to Cayman. Like I said before, we are okay with the substance changes. They are something that's required to meet our international obligations and everything else. But I just want to put it out there to the members of this House and to the public that the overall numbers in the financial services industry are not trending where we would like to see them trending now. A lot of activities are due to also global conditions and other changes elsewhere. But at the end of the day, we need to watch this more carefully. And as I said to the Premier earlier when he said he wasn't in the mood to fight, we told him that basically that financial services and the finance in this country is not something that we should really have major political differences on because of its importance and everything else. So with that said, Mr. Speaker, I just want to say to the government that I'm hoping that before this session of the LA is out, especially on the legal services bill, and first have the uncomfortable conversation in terms of what changes do we need to make to the immigration law to attract more hunters here. Because at the end of the day, many of these other areas are the farmers, they are the beneficiaries of that money that comes in, and we need to make sure that we create an environment that constantly brings businesses to Cayman. And with that said, I just want to on behalf of my colleagues on this side, say that we support the amendments and we support the bill, and we recognize the importance of it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Does any other member wish to speak? The Honorable, the Attorney General.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise to make a short contribution in support of the Limited Liability Partnership Amendment Number 2 Bill 2020, Mr. Speaker. No, thanks. Mr. Speaker, this, as the Honorable Premier in his contribution made clear, is one of those important bills that will assist in making the jurisdiction more attractive for financial services business. Mr. Speaker, the hope is that it will act as an additional pull factor in businesses, attracting international businesses to the Cayman Islands. Mr. Speaker, the Honorable Premier also touched on the fact that the amendments are in fact necessary to address some of the concerns raised in the Financial Action Task Force Mutual Evaluation Report of the Cayman Islands, Mr. Speaker. In particular, he mentioned that the bill ensures that the legislative framework for limited liability partnership addresses 2 of the 63 recommended actions raised by the CFATF assessors in the Cayman Islands' 4th round of mutual evaluation, and which are applicable to LLPs, Mr. Speaker. And the fact that the bill, Mr. Speaker, also, if becomes law, would provide a bit of synergy with the company's law, as well as other legislation. And, Mr. Speaker, that the bill will, among other things, clarifies the information that should be provided by limited liability partnerships upon registration and provide for circumstances for it to be made publicly available. And, Mr. Speaker, that this is in line with recommendation 27 raised in the mutual evaluation report, which said that the Cayman Islands need to implement measures to allow for the basic regulating powers of legal persons to be publicly available. So, Mr. Speaker, this is a very important piece of legislation. And, Mr. Speaker, the timing of it is also of importance. And I say that, Mr. Speaker, because the progress, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that the Cayman Islands anti-money laundering and countering the financing of terrorism, as well as proliferation financing regimes, are compliant with international standards, reaches a very significant milestone today, Mr. Speaker, 23rd of October, Friday 23rd of October, 2020, because, Mr. Speaker, that's when the observation period that has been imposed on the Cayman Islands by the FATF comes to an end. Mr. Speaker, there was after the report was adopted by the CFATF and the FATF, and certain weaknesses were identified, Cayman Islands were given a period of time within which to address these recommended actions, and that was referred to as an observation period, Mr. Speaker, within which we were required to address these things. So, Mr. Speaker, since January 2018, the jurisdiction has passed several significant milestones on the way to improving its AML CFT framework. In particular, Mr. Speaker, in September 2019, an updated national AML safety strategy for 2019 to 2022 was published, and that, Mr. Speaker, among other things, laid out a comprehensive action plan and covering topics from sanctions, Mr. Speaker, to supervisory frameworks. Mr. Speaker, targeted AML safety risk assessments were conducted in 2019 and 2020 with the aim of helping relevant individual entities implement their own effective risk-aware approaches, as well as to improve supervisory/law enforcement processes. These assessments, Mr. Speaker, include terrorist financing, excluded persons under the Securities and Investment Business Law. Mr. Speaker, you heard the Honorable Premier just dealt with a slight amendment to that to deal with the issue of reference to the list of jurisdictions. Mr. Speaker, entities operating in the special zones are also dealt with, as well as non-profit organizations and international financial centers. Mr. Speaker, those are risk assessments that were conducted. Mr. Speaker, since January 2020, SEMA has enhanced, Mr. Speaker, in a significant way, its AML safety supervisory framework of registered persons and has commenced inspections, Mr. Speaker. The authority has introduced new risk rating technology to offer an improved data-led risk-based approach and a new division specifically focused on AML safety supervision, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, designated non-financial businesses and professionals, DNFBPs for short, are also subject to supervision under a number of supervisory bodies, which have issued guidance, including regular outreach, risk-assessed entities, and conduct on-site inspections, as well as issuing fines when entities are found in breach of the anti-money laundering regulations. Mr. Speaker, there have also been targeted and industry-specific outreach that has been going on, Mr. Speaker, since 2019, including in-person sessions for financial institutions and DNFBPs, as well as NPOs, Mr. Speaker. The sessions feature educational presentations, as well as opportunities for question and answers and direct engagement with the respective regulator. E-learning platforms hosted by Cayman Finance have supported these efforts, Mr. Speaker. And so we have instances where approximately 250 people signing up for free courses as of the 3rd of September 2020. Mr. Speaker, a national advertising campaign emphasizing that the responsibility for fighting financial crime is everyone's business was also launched in early 2020, and an improved AMLU website has been operational since that time, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, despite continuing to deal with an ongoing challenges to the jurisdiction from a major global pandemic, the Cayman Islands has taken its requirements to meet the CFATF 63 recommended actions very seriously and has acted strenuously in this regard. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, the actions taken collectively highlight our commitment to ensuring that the Cayman Islands retains its positive ratings from global entities and continues, Mr. Speaker, to remain at the forefront of financial services jurisdiction in the world. Mr. Speaker, after the observation period comes to an end today, the Cayman Islands will move into the next phase of the process, which the FATF will determine, whether we have made sufficient progress. And, Mr. Speaker, the final outcome of that is expected to be announced in February of 2021. So, Mr. Speaker, honorable members would have seen and have in fact observed that over the last 18 months or so we have been doing a number of amendments to legislation. But as I kept saying, Mr. Speaker, this is a shifting goalpost. It's an evolving process. Since we were last evaluated, the issue of virtual assets has now become, regulating virtual assets has now become a requirement. That is something that has been done post evaluation of the Cayman Islands. And so, Mr. Speaker, we continue to, as a jurisdiction, we continue to meet these requirements in a bid to not just remain competitive, but to convince the rest of the world, Mr. Speaker, that what we are operating here is a very reputable financial services industry, Mr. Speaker, and we continue to be the envy of the world in that regard. So, Mr. Speaker, I too commend this bill to honorable members of this House. Thank you.
Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member wish to speak? I call now on the Honorable Premier for his right to wind up the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I thank the Honorable Attorney General and the member from Bordentown West who spoke on behalf of members of the opposition for their observations, and all other members for their tacit support of this important bill.
The question is that a bill shortly entitled the Limited Liability Partnership Amendment Number 2 Bill 2020 be given a second reading. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against? The ayes have it. The Limited Liability Partnership Amendment Number 2 Bill 2020 has been given a second reading.
Judicator Amendment Bill 2020.
Honorable the Attorney General.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg to move the second reading of a bill for a law to amend the Judicator Law 2017 revision to provide for the exercise of the court's jurisdiction to grant protective cost orders in judicial review proceedings and constitutional proceedings, and for incidental and connected purposes.
The bill has been duly moved. Honorable Attorney General, are you speaking there too?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Briefly. Mr. Speaker, this is a very short bill, and as I said, I rise to present the second reading. Mr. Speaker, as we are all aware, litigation can be very expensive, and the full scope of the potential costs, Mr. Speaker, can be difficult to predict. The general principle in litigation matters is that a losing party should pay the winner's reasonable cost. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, some of the general principles of common law litigation can lead to increased cost. Matters such as disclosure, discovery, etc., and of course the very adversarial nature of these cases can, Mr. Speaker, and often do lead to increased cost. A natural consequence of high costs of litigation, Mr. Speaker, is the potential chilling effect on litigation that ought properly to be pursued. But, Mr. Speaker, the risk of a crippling adverse cost order might dissuade a claimant whose case has excellent prospects of success from bringing a claim or launching a legal proceedings. Furthermore, Mr. Speaker, public funding, example, legal aid, may not always provide a remedy, might not always be readily available as a means of dealing with litigation costs. Mr. Speaker, protective cost order is a mechanism available to the court to ensure access to justice in public interest cases. In essence, Mr. Speaker, these orders limit the amounts, if any, which a party can expect to have to pay to the other side if the litigation is unsuccessful. That is, Mr. Speaker, it is an order limiting or removing the liability of a party to judicial review or constitutional challenges to pay another party's cost in connection with any stage of the proceedings. And, Mr. Speaker, because protective cost order will be available in the Grand Court and, of course, the Court of Appeal. Therefore, sir, these applicants or claimants, including those that we often refer to as public-spirited persons, can apply to the court for the protective cost order so as to shield themselves, Mr. Speaker, from hefty cost orders. However, Mr. Speaker, unlike the position in the UK, such matters are not governed in the Cayman Islands by bespoke legislation. Hence, Mr. Speaker, the objective of this bill. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, in the Port referendum case of Rolston and the Cabinet and Legislative Assembly, where a protective cost order was made, the Honorable Chief Justice had this to say, and I quote, "There is no law regulating the granting of protective cost orders in the Cayman Islands, even while, by contrast, in England and Wales, PCO were put on a statutory footing by Section 88 of the Criminal Justice and Courts Act 2015, which largely codifies the Corner House principles," end of quote. Mr. Speaker, because of the absence of the bespoke statutory footing, quote unquote, the Grand Court in the Rolston application for PCO had to rely on inherent and or statutory bases to assume jurisdiction to deal with the application. The Grand Court, Mr. Speaker, relied primarily on a case from the UK, Corner House versus the Secretary for Trade and Industry, 2005. The Corner House case for short. But, Mr. Speaker, in 2005, when the UK court decided Corner House, there was no legislation there either. So in 2015, the UK understandably decided that legislation was required in order to deal with such applications. And they did so, Mr. Speaker, via sections 88 and 89 of the UK Criminal Justice and Courts Act 2015, and, Mr. Speaker, which is reflected in Clause 3 of the bill before the House. These, Mr. Speaker, as in the UK, sets out the principles and the considerations that would guide the courts in determining how to make a protective cost order. As I said earlier, Mr. Speaker, the order is defined in Clause 2 of the bill as an order limiting or removing the liability of a party to judicial review or constitutional challenges to pay another party's cost in connection with such proceedings. Constitutional challenges, Mr. Speaker, include those which may be brought pursuant to Section 26 of the Bill of Rights, Part 1 of the schedule to the 2009 order, as well as those which may be instituted in relation to non-Bill of Rights matters under the Constitution. And while such applications may typically involve private interest, Mr. Speaker, they may nonetheless raise matters of considerable public interest and importance. Continuing, Mr. Speaker, the bill sets out the possible terms, rather, of the orders. It also deals with the procedure to apply for the order and the procedure for the eventual granting, Mr. Speaker, of such orders. The proposed amendment, Mr. Speaker, to the Judicator law would therefore not only codify the common law Corner House principles, but also, like in the UK, improve upon those principles in terms largely similar to the provisions in the UK 2015 Act, and thereby provide a bespoke statutory footing and thus greater clarity for our courts when adjudicating on PCO applications. Mr. Speaker, given that the issue of cost generally is a matter for the discretion of the court, it was only appropriate that the judiciary be consulted on the contents of the bill. So the bill was therefore sent to the judiciary for consultation, and they found the bill, Mr. Speaker, quote, to be quite in order. I therefore commend this bill to this honorable House. I thank you.
Does any other member wish to speak? The Deputy Leader of the Opposition, member from Newlands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Speaker, I wish to briefly offer, on behalf of the official opposition, our position on the Judicator Amendment Bill 2020. Mr. Speaker, I listened intently to the Honorable Attorney General when he introduced the bill. And on the surface of what he said, you would think that there wasn't really a lot that I would have to say this afternoon, but I do, unfortunately, have some concerns in relation to this bill. Well, it is part of our responsibilities as the official opposition to critique and offer suggestions. So that is what we're attempting to do here today, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, overall, what has been introduced here by the Honorable Attorney General is, in my opinion, what should be done at a very high level, taking the discretion out of the process of deciding, of the courts deciding whether or not to grant a protective court order. And it's good to put things in legislation and have it set down so that there can be, less uncertainty. But Mr. Speaker, I also did a little research, and as the Honorable Attorney General said, some of the guiding principles in relation to the granting of a protective court order was derived from the Corner House case, as he mentioned. And I see where there's quite a few similarities between this proposed legislation and what was outlined in that case and what later became statute in the United Kingdom, in England. But Mr. Speaker, I want to go through some of the clauses in the bill that cause some concern for me. And hopefully the Honorable Attorney General will take those on board. Mr. Speaker, Clause 24B. Sorry, 24B, subclause Sorry. Yeah, subclause 2B. It says if the applicant is a body corporate that is unable to demonstrate that it is likely to have financial resources available to meet such liabilities, information about its members and about their ability to provide financial support for the purposes of this legislation. And that is in making a decision on a protective cost order may be made in connection with judicial review proceedings in accordance with sections 24A, 24B, and 24C, or in connection with constitutional proceedings. And this is in determining whether or not to grant this, the court would then look at, if it's a corporate body, look at the financial resources available through the individuals who belong to that corporation. And that raises a concern for me, Mr. Speaker, because the whole point of having a corporation is to protect those who are involved in the corporation personally. So it would be the shareholders or whoever are the members of that corporation. But this seems to give the court the ability then to make a decision based on the personal finances of those shareholders or members. And I think that creates a bit of a conflict in another area, which would be on the company law or whatever other laws we have that would govern those corporations. Because the whole premise of of being a member of a corporation is that you're protecting yourself personally in some aspects. So I'm not sure if that is something that we want to have in the legislation, but I'd be interested in hearing what the Honorable Attorney General has to say about it. 24B3, Mr. Speaker, the court may make protective cost orders only if it is satisfied that, and it goes on to list all those tests that the court would use. I'm a little concerned with that wording, only if, because if you refer to the ruling of the Court of Appeal, the ruling of the Court of Appeal, Mr. Speaker, in R.V. Lord Chancellor, ex parte Child Poverty Action Group. There's a ruling by the court that basically says that these conditions, while they're guidelines and they can be used by the court in making the decision, they weren't really set in stone, and there should be some discretion allowed in determining whether or not to make the decision. These were principles that were laid down, but it's a bit concerning when the legislation actually says only if. I would suggest that we consider the wording that the court must consider the following, rather than saying only if, because that makes it very, very rigid, and there's no discretion at all. So if the application doesn't meet all of these conditions, I'm assuming then no protective cost order would be granted. So Speaker, 24B5, again, these matters to which the court shall have regard when the matters to which the court shall have regard when determining whether proceedings are public interest proceedings include A, the number of people likely to be directly affected if relief is granted to the applicant for the judicial review proceedings or constitutional proceedings, B, how significant the effect on those people is likely to be, and C, whether the proceedings involve consideration of a point of law of general public importance. And I agree with all those. All those are fine. But the primary objective here in determining whether it's a public interest proceeding is whether or not the government is acting contrary to public policy. So I would think that that would be one of those conditions in determining whether or not it is in the public interest. That would be one of the main questions you would be asking. Is the government acting contrary to public policy? So I would, as a suggestion, I think that maybe that condition could be inserted in there. Or if there's a question on whether or not the government is acting contrary to public policy. Mr. Speaker, also 24C1A. The matters to which the court shall have regard when considering whether to make a protective court order in connection with judicial review proceedings or constitutional proceedings, and what the terms of such an order should be, include A, the financial resources of the parties to the proceedings, including the financial resources of any person who provides or may provide financial support to the parties. Now, again, I understand at a high level why you would want to know the financial position of those who are contributing to this judicial challenge or constitutional challenge. But when it talks about those who may provide financial support, I think that opens the door to a lot of speculation. How do you know, how do you determine who may be providing financial assistance? And in my mind, that then creates a situation where people could make frivolous claims. That I know that Al Suku is trying to bring a judicial review against the government, and Kenneth Bryan may assist him financially in the future. It's one of those situations where it's guesswork. So using the word who may financially provide support, someone on the other side could easily throw out some claims and say, well, I could name 5 other people who may assist financially. So if that could be looked at as well, because there's a lot of potential speculation there that could slow down making these decisions or hamper making these decisions. With 24(1)(c), again, same sort of concern. It says, to the extent to which any person who has provided or may provide the applicant with financial support is likely to benefit if relief is granted to the applicant for the judicial review proceedings or constitutional proceedings. Again, it's that speculative nature of this test where you don't know ahead of time who may be providing financial support. So I raised those. I mean, maybe there are valid reasons why it's worded that way, but in my mind it creates a lot of uncertainty and a lot of speculation, Also, Mr. Speaker, 24C1E. And again, in the court giving consideration for whether or not to make a protective court order, C says whether the applicant for the order is an appropriate person to represent the interests of other persons or the public interest generally. Now, I don't think I see a definition of appropriate person in the bill. And I would question what is an appropriate person? I did a little research. I didn't see in the case law where that was referred to either, but I may have missed it. But what does that mean? What is an appropriate person? Because if it's not properly defined, again, the other side in one of these cases could argue that so-and-so is not an appropriate person, and insert their own definition of what an appropriate person should be. And I think that introduces a level of unfairness in the argument. If it's properly defined, then we don't have to worry about it. So that's another suggestion I'm making, is that let's define what that means. Because my definition of appropriate person and someone else's definition could be complete opposites. So, Speaker, I know members of the opposition did question why some of this verbiage was put in here. And in particular, the body corporate argument that I introduced earlier, because we are aware that while Ms. Rolston filed this, I think on her own behalf, filed her action in court on her own behalf, she was a member of CPR. And we question whether or not that clause in particular is being directed for those sorts of instances where people may have speculated that she was getting financially assisted by members of CPR. But I think it's unfair that we would put that in there for those types of scenarios, because CPR wasn't party to the judicial review. So to bring their membership under scrutiny in the law, the finances of their membership, I think would be unfair. So I'm wondering if that is why that clause was put in there. Sorry? But the Attorney General is assuring me no. I'm sure he will explain why that's there when he gets up. But Mr. Speaker, those are our concerns with this bill. Overall, we support the putting this into legislation, having rules defined, the process and procedure defined so that it's clear. I think it does provide a heightened level of protection to those who wish to challenge decisions of the government or challenge sections of the Constitution or not the Constitution, but things that may pertain to the Constitution. Decisions that may pertain to the Constitution. So it's a good thing that we're doing this. I support it, but aside from those observations I made and those concerns, and I would be interested in hearing what the justification and logic was behind having those included. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Does any other member wish to speak? The member for Georgetown Central.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't intend to be very, very long, because my colleague, the Honorable Deputy Opposition Leader, covered pretty much almost 95% of what I want to say in respect to my concerns about the bill. I must say that though I do accept the necessity of this bill, the timing of it could be suspicious. And I'll give you the reasons why. Particularly, we've had a number of controversial challenges to the state and the governance of the country, more so than any other time in recent history. And though I recognize the Attorney General says what the Chief Justice noted in respect to the importance of creation of such a bill, it blows my mind how quickly a bill can be drafted, because even in this sitting of the House, we highlighted some other bills that needs to be drafted for the importance of democracy and growth for the people of the Cayman Islands that seem to can't get 1 hour worth of drafting time or attention. And I'm not suggesting that's because of the drafting department, but I know that there are people who make the priority list on drafting of bills, and it's not those who work doing the drafting itself. They're civil servants, and they're paid to do what they're instructed to do in respect to the order they were given. But Mr. Speaker, the interesting part that I found was forgive me, Mr. Speaker. Earlier in this Honorable House, we spoke about the necessity to amend a very, very important piece of legislation called the Advisory District Council's Law. We heard about how much we don't have the time to deal with it and the like. Mr. Speaker, you heard the Attorney General talk about the challenge by Ms. Ralston, and that was, if my memory serves me well, 10 months ago, 10 months? About 10 months, maybe close to a year ago. I can't recall the exact date, but I don't think we've passed a year yet. But this bill that we're currently debating is 9 pages long. The District Council's law, which gives the people more say in their democracy and in the way that we represent them, is also 9 pages long. But somebody put it at the top of the priority to make sure to create a law when we have all the excuses in the world to say we don't have capacity, we got so much work in the drafting department, to make a law that will make it more, let me see if I can say this in the right way, make it a stronger deterrent for the average person to challenge the state and constitutional challenges and let me use the appropriate terminology, Mr. Speaker, and judicial review proceedings. Now, we know, Mr. Speaker, if there ever is such a challenge before the courts, it's obviously because most likely citizens believe that something is wrong with the system, and therefore they want to take it and challenge it in our high courts. That's a part of democracy as well. And Mr. Speaker, what bothers me is the priority to make sure you have a law that put hurdles in the way of that challenge and holding those in power accountable, to create a law that potentially could put hurdles in the way, was put at the top of the priority list. But when we have a law exactly the same amount of pages,
Can I just, Mr. Speaker, I hate
Honorable
to interrupt
Attorney
the
General.
member. I hate to interrupt the member, but can your members point to this language in this bill, the language in the bill which put hurdles in someone's way?
Member for Georgetown Central.
Mr. Speaker, I apologize. I see the Attorney General's argument, but by all means, when I say the word hurdle, it's not helping you in respect to the challenge. So if anything there is a fear of having to pay costs, it's considered a hurdle. I don't mean it in a negative capacity, but, well, Mr. Speaker, I will accept that the Attorney General does not agree with my terminology of this law being a potential hurdle, but that's my interpretation. And that's what some members in the public interpret this bill to be. Though I understand the necessity, because if we don't have a law like this, there may be people who have nothing better else to do than to challenge every single thing the government does. I'm not talking about the fact that the bill is not necessary. I'm talking about the priority in respect to the necessities of what laws we deal with in this country. And the common excuse is we have so many things to deal with in the drafting department. We have governments who've made it a part of their national campaign to make an amendment, not create a brand new law. The drafting department was able, within less than 10 months, to create a whole new law, Mr. Speaker.
Honorable Member, I understand your desire to have a law or something you need and something you complained about, but the debate is on the law presently before us. And so you have to debate the merits or demerits of that bill. I think you have made known your complaint about what you think should be dealt with. Well, you have made that, and I ask you to move on now to the merits or demerits as you see fit.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to make a clarification. This is an amendment to an original law, so I was wrong in that. But the same amount of work that could have been prioritized in respect to this amendment could have been done for other important bills. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That's my contribution.
Does any other member wish to speak? If no other member wish to speak, I will call on the Honorable Attorney General to wind up.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I thank honorable members for their contribution to the bill. And like you, I just want to, I wish member would focus on the language of the bill. And let me just say, Mr. Speaker, I wish we could take credit for the language of this piece of legislation. But, Mr. Speaker, we did not reinvent the wheel. The honorable member, the deputy leader of the opposition briefly made brief reference, to the UK legislation and the Corner House case. I am not sure whether he had the chance to look at the UK legislation, because, Mr. Speaker, what we did was lift sections 88 and 89 of the UK legislation word for word and put it in the bill. The only thing that is not in the UK legislation, and I'll just make sure that I make a copy available for the House to be put on the table so that members can have the benefit of that. But, Mr. Speaker, it is the Criminal Justice and Courts Act 2015. The only thing that is not in this piece of legislation, Mr. Speaker, the UK that is the word constitutional challenges, because the UK doesn't have a written constitution. And so, Mr. Speaker, it was agreed that there are constitutional challenges that are of significant public importance and for which persons ought to be able to bring proceedings against a state without having to be looking over their shoulders as to whether or not they would be saddled with serious cost orders. And so the constitutional challenges, Mr. Speaker, were included in the provision. So it covers constitutional challenges and judicial review proceedings, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, for example, he speaks about why body corporate is included and the fact that, according to him, the potential here for the court to reach or to go behind the veil, so to speak, and access or require the natural persons, the ownership of the company to make the payments. Mr. Speaker, Section 88.5b of the UK legislation says, if the applicant is a body corporate that is unable to demonstrate that it is likely to have financial resources available to meet such liabilities, information about its members and about their ability to provide financial support for the purposes of the application. Word for word, Mr. Speaker. So we didn't make that up. And in the case in which he cited CPR, I don't think it was a body corporate. I think it was an NPO. I think it's one of those registered NPOs. So in an event, it didn't apply. And when you read the Chief Justice's judgment, Mr. Speaker, the question of whether or not CPR should be required to fund the litigation for Ms. Rolston was canvassed extensively, discussed extensively, and the Chief Justice ruled that Ms. Rolston had made it quite clear that she was acting in her own right and not on behalf of CPR, and not on behalf of CPR, and so he was not prepared to make any order that would require CPR to fund the litigation, Mr. Speaker. But I think I need to just clarify for honorable members what this is about, because at the beginning of my presentation, I made it quite clear that the usual protocol, the usual rule, is that where you have a litigation, the unsuccessful party pays the cost of the winner. That is the case. So it is an obligation, Mr. Speaker, that if you are going to launch litigation, it's a potential obligation that if you're unsuccessful, you will be saddled with costs, because the other side have to expend costs to defend the claim, and so. So, Mr. Speaker, in the usual course of things, if you bring an action against the government and you're unsuccessful, you should pay the government's costs. In the same way, if the government is unsuccessful, the government pays the other side's costs. And so there's nothing unfair or unusual about that. That's what Section 24, the Judicator Law, gives the court the jurisdiction or the discretion to determine who pays what costs. We had the same-sex matter that went to the court. The government lost at first instance. No cost was awarded against government because the court in its discretion didn't think it should do so. The government won at the Court of Appeal. And the Court of Appeal refused to order costs again in favor of the government because the court has a discretion to do so. Completely. So, one party won at the first instance. The court says, although you were successful, we're not going to order costs. The government won at the Court of Appeal. The court says, well, we're not going to order costs against the other side, and so. It's a discretion for the court. So when the member from the deputy leader of the opposition speaks about deputy leader. Thank you, Mr. Leader. Oh, okay. No, didn't mean to undermine you either. So, promoting him. So when the deputy leader mentioned that the language which says, if the court is satisfied, Mr. Speaker, the point I'm making there is that the court has to be satisfied that it is in the interest of justice. It is just and fair not to give the winner its cost. Put another way, the court also needs to be satisfied that it is fair and just, to use language of the Chief Justice. It is fair and just not to order costs against the unsuccessful party. That's what it is. And the language of the legislation is the protective cost order. And what it means is that if you are unsuccessful, you either pay no cost at all, or you pay a portion of what you would normally be required to pay. That's what it does. It doesn't impede anybody from bringing any proceedings before the court. It doesn't put any hurdle. Quite the opposite, Mr. Speaker. What it does is enables people to bring action before the court and not have to be worried about whether I'm going to be saddled with a $250,000 cost order if I am unsuccessful, if I lose the case. That's all it does. And so, what, as I said, we didn't make this up. Sorry.
For my edification, this should avoid frivolous claims, etc.
Mr. Speaker, yes or no? Yeah. Because if you use judicial review, for example, you can only get a protective cost order if you get leave to file judicial
To
review.
have the review.
Right. So you have to cross the hurdle first of getting leave, satisfying the court that you have an arguable case before the issue of a protective
Thank
cost
you.
order kicks in. Right. Sorting. So that is how it was. That is how the English statute operate. That is how ours operate. So, it goes without saying, because there's no point of you applying for and obtaining a cost order unless you know you're going to get leave to file for judicial review. And so in a way, that's what it does. What it does. And so, but I said yes and no, because it is when you apply for judicial review, when you apply for leave for judicial review, it is at that stage that the court makes a determination as to whether you have an arguable case or not. In other words, whether your case is frivolous and all sort of thing. And if they agree that your case has merit, then you get leave to apply, and of course you then apply for your cost order. So that's how it works, Mr. Speaker. But none of the provisions, let me just make it clear, none of the provisions in 24C highlighted by the Honourable Member, Mr. Speaker, are matters that were made up by us. They're all lifted word for word from the UK legislation and inserted in the bill. And there are a number of case laws which says how these things are to be interpreted, Mr. Speaker, including the issue of appropriate. Who is an appropriate person, I think, is the language he had some concerns about. Section 89 1C of the UK Criminal Justice and Courts Act 2015. Section 89 1C says, matters to which the court must have regard when considering whether to make a cost capping order in connection with judicial review proceedings and what the terms of such an order should be include. E, whether the applicant for the order is an appropriate person to represent the interests of other persons or the public interest generally. So again, Mr. Speaker, it is lifted word for word out of the UK legislation. And I think, I just want to make sure that there's a copy to be put on the table for benefit of honourable members, Mr. Speaker. Criminal Justice and Courts Act 2015 and so. So, Mr. Speaker, I heard the members' concerns, and I would just like to assure him, Mr. Speaker, that we didn't make these language up. It is basically precedent from the UK 2015 legislation that we lifted and inserted in this bill, except, as I said, for the word constitutional challenges, which you won't find in the UK legislation, Mr. Speaker. And as to how some of these things are interpreted, Mr. Speaker, there are a number of cases dealing with these issues, UK cases, of course, dealing with these issues. The case that we had with Mr. Rolson is the first time an application of this nature has been made in the Cayman Islands. And the Honourable Chief Justice pointed out, Mr. Speaker, that unlike the UK, there is no legislation, bespoke legislation in the Cayman Islands that deals with the issue. And so, Mr. Speaker, as to issue of timing, an issue raised by the member from Georgetown Central, it is not unusual, Mr. Speaker, for me to bring legislation to this House to deal with matters of administration of justice. It has always been, Mr. Speaker, the case that once there is an issue that deals with administration of justice, governments over the years move very quickly to ensure that if there are legislative corrections that need to be made or things to be put in place to facilitate administration of justice, Mr. Speaker, we always do so. So there is nothing suspicious about bringing the legislation now as opposed to 10 months later and so, because the legislation itself is quite in order, it's quite appropriate, and it's quite beneficial to those who, Mr. Speaker, would seek to pursue an application for protective cost order. So, Mr. Speaker, I hope I've allayed the fears of the honourable member, and I would be happy to discuss the UK, the extract from the UK legislation with him at the appropriate stage, and so on. So, with those words, I commend the bill to honourable members.
Question is that a bill shortly entitled the Judicature Amendment Bill 2020 be given its second reading. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against? The ayes have it. The Judicature Amendment Bill 2020 has been given a second reading. We have reached the hour of 4:30, and the Minister of Finance will move the suspension of standing orders.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move the suspension of Standing Order 10.2 in order that the business of the House can continue beyond the hour of interruption.
Question is that Standing Order 10.2 be suspended in order for business to continue after the hour of 4:30. All in favor? Aye. Those against?
No.
The ayes certainly have it.
Public Health Amendment Bill 2020.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Put this on before they report this. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I rise to seek the support of this Honourable House for the Public Health Amendment Bill 2020. The Public Health Law 2002 revision, enacted in 1981, Mr. Speaker, out of abundance of caution, I move to seek a second reading and on the bill entitled Public Health Amendment Bill 2020.
The bill has been duly moved. Honourable Minister of Health speaking thereto.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Public Health Law 2002 revision, enacted in 1981, repealed the Public Health Law 1974. This law is the main piece of public health legislation for the Cayman Islands. Public health legislation aims to protect, promote, and improve the health and well-being of the people of the Cayman Islands and to reduce the incidence of preventable illnesses. Mr. Speaker, as we are all aware, the new coronavirus disease, known as the COVID-19, has created one of the greatest pandemics, infecting millions of persons and taking lives of hundreds of thousands of people around the globe. Mr. Speaker, in the management of COVID-19 disease, we have done very well in the Cayman Islands as a government and as a community. Mr. Speaker, to date, there have been 221 confirmed cases of COVID-19 in the Cayman Islands, with 211 recoveries. Members of this Honorable House may recall the gentleman who sadly succumbed to this disease a few days after arriving in Grand Cayman via cruise ship. The only death in Cayman related to COVID-19. Although Cayman has been in the clear with minimal community transmission, the threat is still real beyond our borders, and many countries are still in the midst of this pandemic. Mr. Speaker, as the Cayman Islands commenced a phased reopening of the borders on the 1st of October 2020, the ministry is concerned that the fines for breaching mandatory quarantines are too low, given the risk to the Cayman Islands if a traveler who carries COVID-19 breaches quarantine and potentially spreads the virus. Currently, if a person breaks the mandatory 14-day isolation for the surveillance, they will be liable on conviction of a fine of $1,000 and imprisonment for 6 months. Mr. Speaker, the bill we have before us today aims to increase this penalty to a fine of $10,000 or 2 years imprisonment for breach or mandatory quarantine. In order to allow for this increased penalty from $1,000 to $10,000 and imprisonment from 6 months to 2 years, Section 71(2) of the Public Health Law 2002 revision requires an amendment. Mr. Speaker, I will now speak to the provisions of the Public Health Amendment Bill 2020. Clause 1 provides a short title of the legislation. Clause 2 seeks to amend Section 71(2) of the Public Health Law 2002 revision to increase the penalty for contravention of a provision of the law which no specific penalty has been provided. Mr. Speaker, the amendment seeks to increase the fine from $1,000 to $10,000, increase the term of imprisonment from 6 months to a term of 2 years, and increase the fine for a continuing offense to $500 for each day that the offense continues after conviction. Once this bill has been passed by this Honorable House, the increased penalty will be imposed on persons entering the Cayman Islands who breach quarantine in accordance with the control of the COVID-19, number 2, Regulations 2020. Mr. Speaker, I believe I speak for the majority of us that the amendment presented today to this Honorable House benefits everyone, as we want to deter persons from breaching quarantine, deter persons from visiting those under quarantine and home isolation in order to protect everyone in these islands. One person who may be carrying COVID-19 and breaks quarantine can subsequently infect anyone they come in contact with. This not only makes contact tracing difficult for the Public Health Department, but it may and can introduce clusters of cases or a worst case scenario, community transmission. Mr. Speaker, as you may be aware of a pilot quarantine program introduced on Thursday, 17th of September, 2020, which allowed some arriving passengers to isolate at home rather than in an approved government facility. This program is enforced by the geofencing technology, where each person quarantined in home isolation wears a wristband. So far, Mr. Speaker, the trial has been going well, and people are mostly compliant. sticking to the isolation rules. While the proposed amendment is necessary as we get ready to roll out the full program next month, when we commence the first phase of gradual border reopening, the ministry continues to work with the legislative drafting department to update the Public Health Law 2002 revision with the recommended amendments proposed by the Public Health Legislation Review Committee established in 2018. The current Public Health Law 2002 revision is outdated and requires a great amount of revision. We anticipate that the proposed amendments to the law should be completed and sent to Cabinet for their consideration in 2021. In closing, Mr. Speaker, I must specifically thank the members of the Legislative Drafting Department and the staff at the Ministry who have contributed to putting the amendments together. I look forward to the support of all members of this honorable House. I thank you and God bless.
Does any other member wish to speak? The Honorable the Leader of the Opposition. To who?
I'm gonna be left on, but I need a little time to read something out. My concern is, go ahead, go ahead.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. Mr. Speaker, I listened to the minister, and I can't say that I am tickled by what the minister has said, because he specifically said that this is to deter people from encroaching on orders made by public health. Now, we are amending Section 7 to 1. 7 to 1 provides for penalties, and the penalty, and 7 to 1 2 in particular, as the minister said, is specifically geared at areas in the law that there are no defined penalties. Now, Mr. Speaker, I have reviewed this law in its entirety, and fines range between $50 and $1,000. There are a couple of places within the law where it refers to being guilty of an offense, and then you refer, that goes over to the saving provision for there not being a defined fine, can I say? Penalty. And that's $1,000. Mr. Speaker, I understand what the ministers try and do and all those in public health. But I have been here long enough to know you cannot legislate morality.
Honorable
No.
Leader of the Opposition, you referred to the public health law. What section?
7 to 1 2. This is Public Health Law 2002 revision.
70.
7 to 1, Mr. Speaker, 7 to 1 2,
Okay.
subsection 2. Subsection 2.
7
Now-
to 1 and subsection 2.
Right.
Continue.
Mr. Speaker, I've been here long enough to know that your chances of getting people to adhere by fear doesn't work. You are going to find people who knowingly or unknowingly, I understand the law says that if they were, or if it is known, if the person knows that they are breaking the law, then that's completely different to the circumstances of unknowingly doing it. And what we're saying is that we're moving from $1,000 to $10,000. Now, Mr. Speaker, I know the courts has said on more than one occasion that they don't like people to tie their hands with minimums. And when we say $1,000, they have the flexibility of doing that, up to that amount, depending on the circumstances. Now, Mr. Speaker, the government during COVID applied a $3,000 fine on those who would break the regulations. I noticed some over there saying no and shaking their head. Well, let me relate a case to you. We made a regulation saying that you couldn't go to the beach, albeit we put it under the police law. Yeah. And there was no provisions for it, for $3,000 fine. This is for suppression of COVID. And I had a gentleman in East End whose dog escaped him and ran out on the beach, and the police found him getting the dog out of the sea. And yet they charged him. The judge would not even apply $1,000. But once he gets to go pay the fine, shortly thereafter, they applied the $3,000. I said all that to say that's what happens in these circumstances. Now, Mr. Speaker, I don't think anyone should be breaking in particular in this case, the suppression regulations. Now, there are only 3 places in here that I find that there's no specified fines. If someone else knows any others, they can let me know what they are. 24. Is whoever refuses or neglects to comply with any direction given by a medical officer of health, having as its purpose the prevention, control, or suppression of an infectious disease, or enters a hospital or any place used for the reception of carriers or persons suffering from an infectious disease, or leaves such hospital or place without the permission of such an officer, refuses or neglects to comply with any of the requirements of or condition of observation, isolation, or surveillance is guilty of an offense. Now, that's one instance that the $1,000 apply. Now, Mr. Speaker, I thought that the government, and rightly so, had taken it upon themselves to ensure people stay within these isolations. I thought the government had done that. It is not free like in America that they talk about their rights and their whatnot, and they're free to roam. It was a decision made by the government. I believe $1,000 is sufficient for or if we even want to go up to $3,000, but $10,000, Mr. Speaker? I understand the dangers that it poses to the public, but the combination of government protecting those places, and something like $3,000, I think is sufficient. It's not going to deter people. You hope it does. The other one, Mr. Speaker, is infected person not to carry on occupation. That is 26, Section 26 of the law. If someone knows they're suffering from a disease, or is nursing or attending on a case of infectious disease, milks any animal, engages in any occupation connected with food or carries on any trade or business in such a manner as is likely to spread the infectious disease. I understand but my position is there's no need for $10,000 on that, because what we're saying is we're hoping that the $10,000 throws them in a state of fear, but it's not doing it. Then we have another one about removal of bodies. I would like to think that hospitals and place used for the reception of persons suffering from infectious disease shall not be removed without the permission of a medical officer of health. I would like to think that a body would have been received already by the authorities. $10,000. What do we think we are in this country, body snatchers? Mr. Speaker, I'm not saying that there is need to deter people from doing it, but $10,000 is a little excessive. You can't put up draconian fines that will and hope that they deter people. If we were only putting it on the books just to have it on the books, but how many cases have we experienced? You start again? You can't help yourself. That premier, tell you he's incorrigible.
before we get into there, we'll take the suspension until 5:45. We'll break and come back at 5:45. I can hear you.